Hello and welcome to the STEM in 30 mission debrief on World War II and Victory in Europe Day. We are really excited about this program today. The latest episode of STEM in 30 came out last week and is all about World War II, Victory in Europe, and telling veteran stories. We hope that you get a chance to go check that out. As you're watching today, we've got some great experts joining us. Be sure to put those questions down in the comments section. Also, let us know where you're watching from because we would love to give you some shout outs as the program goes on today. We are very lucky today, and we are joined by Jeremy Kinney, curator in the Aeronautics Department of the National Air and Space Museum, Seth Paridon, historian and digital content manager from the World War II Museum in New Orleans, and Kate Fitgerald, distance learning specialist, also from the World War II Museum in New Orleans. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Glad to be here.
So we're going to jump in today. Remember, if you've got questions for our experts, please put them down in the comments section, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Jeremy, let's start with you and let's get that overview a little bit about what is Victory in Europe.
On May 8th, 1945, Nazi Germany surrenders to the Allies, United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union primarily, and it marks the end of the war in Europe for World War II that started in 1939. And it's this moment of so much release and so much happiness that the war is over in the European theater, but as also there's more to come in terms of fighting in the Pacific. So it's a very sobering retrospective reaction to the end of the war, overcoming Nazi Germany, and especially in this new type of warfare that's so much defined by air power and military aviation, in which you have the Battle of Britain. You have the United States coming into the war with a strategic bombing force, the 8th and 15th Air Forces, as well as a tactical Air Force, the 12th and 9th Air Forces. They're going to help support this invasion of Europe to free occupied Europe.
All right, Seth, tell us a little bit about the role that bombers played in this victory.
Well, bombers played, strategic bombers, we'll specifically stick with those. We'll stick with the B-17s and the B-24s, primarily the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force. 8th was based in England and the UK, and the 15th was, they kind of bounced around, but for more of the war, they were based in Italy. They were a strategic force. They were sent out to destroy German industry, Germany's war-making ability, to a lesser extent, Germany's morale. But to be real, they were formed initially to destroy Germany's ability to wage war across the continent of Europe. And as the aerial campaign dragged on, one of the goals became to clear the skies of the German Luftwaffe so we, being the Allies, could launch our invasion of Europe in 1944, which of course is D-Day. And in order to do that, we had to have control of the air. And that is one role that the Army Air Forces, the 8th specifically, played a huge role in helping to clear the skies of the Luftwaffe so we could successfully launch that cross-channel invasion. And so our invading forces would not be, and they were molested by German air forces, let's be clear, but not, destroyed, utterly destroyed on the beachheads by the German Luftwaffe. And that's a huge role that they played, and that's something that's very important to the overall victory.
All right, well, we've got questions coming in. We've got folks watching from Alabama, Wisconsin, Michigan, Colorado, my hometown, Missouri, Georgia, North Carolina, Illinois, Lancaster, New York, Virginia, D.C., Louisiana, France, Arizona, and I am really excited about this. I think our first viewers from Hawaii are checking in. I know the time difference there is pretty rough, but actually from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So awesome. Thank you guys for tuning in. Please put those questions down in the comments. Kate, I want to ask you a little bit about some of the programming that the National World War II Museum in New Orleans is doing, during this time.
Awesome. Well, first I want to thank Marty for letting the World War II Museum be part of this mission debrief. And although our museum, as you can see behind me, is indeed closed, we are still putting out a lot of content. And just like everybody else, it's all online and it's all digital. So we actually go live every single day. The beginning of the week is for a general audience and adult learners, although everyone's welcome. But on Thursdays and Fridays, we actually do K-12 student programming. And speaking of Pearl Harbor, we actually worked with Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum to do a program. And tomorrow, I'm wondering if anybody out there knows, tomorrow, May 8th, what's so special about that day? Because we're doing a program and interviewing an actual World War II veteran and former POW, Jim Bainham, who actually happens to be related to someone who works at our museum. And of course, it actually is the 20th anniversary of our museum in June. So we're going to do a lot of digital programming for that as well.
Awesome. Sounds like you guys have some really great stuff going on. So we've got questions starting to roll in. Joel from Pooler, Georgia wants to know, what was the most influential part that started the victory? So was there one thing that kind of tipped the scales for the victory in Europe?
Well, I think that from the perspective of the Army Air Forces as well as the Royal Air Force, it's this round-the-clock bombing campaign that starts, as soon as the war is ramped up for the British and the Americans join in on that. But it's that very crucial phase in the summer, fall of 1943, and that transition to that war of attrition during the day, in which the 8th and the 15th Air Force is going to bring up the Luftwaffe so that the fighter aircraft, the escorts, Mustangs, P-38s, P-47s, can destroy the Luftwaffe in the air. And it's that change in that basic strategy of destroying the Luftwaffe to get that air superiority, as Seth had talked about, that enables that ground invasion at Normandy to happen, in which you can control the air, but you also have to take the ground as well.
Yeah, I second that 100%. It was, you can point to really kind of one specific raid. Now, of course, there were several after, but the March 6, 1944 raid on Berlin by the 8th Air Force. That was a raid in which the 8th targeted factories like the Erkner ball bearing plant outside of Berlin. There were several different factories and strategic targets that were targeted by the 8th. But the main goal of that raid was to actually lure the Luftwaffe up into the air for a fight. And because our whole goal was to kill as many German fighter pilots as we could as Jeremy said, to wear down that Luftwaffe so we could launch that cross-channel invasion. And it happened a little bit before March 6th, but there wasn't really a whole lot of success. And the reason Berlin was chosen was because it was Berlin. And it was the capital of the Reich. We knew that they were going to come up and fight if we were going to Berlin. That's exactly what happened. And that's not the tipping point, but that certainly started the fall, if you will. It certainly started things to tip over, if you want to say it like that.
And you definitely have to take the war to the enemy, right? I mean, and Berlin is such a symbolic, target for the bomber forces. Also, we often talk about strategic bombing, the 8th Air Force especially, and there's this great the series going to come out sometime soon about the Masters of the Air, the Miller book, or the 8th Air Force. We'll see that hopefully soon. But there's also the role of the airplane when the invasion happens and in anticipation of the invasion. So you have these tactical air forces, both American and British. They're going to take part of this invasion. We also have to think about the Eastern Front, which is a primarily Soviet tactical air force pushing, west towards Berlin. But this idea of these bombers that are going to soften up the gun emplacements at Normandy, bomb the rail, the road, the canal intersections and all of that, in terms of facilitating that ground force moving across France and through Europe towards Berlin.
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% right. The 9th Air Force played a huge role in that too. The 8th did too as the invasion goes on, but the 9th does as well. And that they're a tactical air force. So they're the guys that are roaming in the air, and those P-47s and P-51s and 38s and B26s, and they are hitting those bridges and those roads that the Germans are trying to feed resupplies and troops and all kinds of things to the beachhead, to the invasion front, and they can't, because the Army Air Forces and the RAF are just roaming almost at will and just inflicting tremendous damage on the Germans. So there's so much so that they have to start moving at night.
Wow. All right. Well, we've got folks from Texas, Maine, Argentina, the Netherlands, all over the country. Thank you all for tuning in, and please put those questions down in the comments section. And I've got a question coming up here in a minute. I'm going to save it for a second that I think might start a fight here. So we'll save that one for a second. But Kate, we've got somebody, I assume this is probably coming from a teacher or parent. How do you teach about those difficult subjects at the museum?
That's a really great question. And we at the museum, we do a lot of different things, but using oral history clips is something, and Seth has a lot to do with our oral history, so he can speak a lot about that. It's something that we emphasize and we put a lot of work into. And so we have entire oral histories online but we break them down. And so it's really nice when, you're talking about strategic bombing, first to explain any of the words. And I was going to actually ask Seth, when we're talking about strategic bombing, what does strategic even mean? What does strategy mean? So breaking down those words and then pairing them with a real person, right? If we're talking about Pearl Harbor, hear Don Stratton, a late now Pearl Harbor survivor, talk about what it was like to be on the USS Arizona. And since our museum has closed, we have been putting out a lot of 2 to 3 minute clips for teacher use specifically. And so that is something that we really emphasize teachers using. Joining a Facebook group, we have one for our museum, which is specifically helping teachers and find resources for World War II. So yeah, there's a lot online, and of course, reaching out to museum educators. That's what we're here for.
Awesome. And also, if you check out the latest, go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think we have to give the National World War II Museum a lot of credit for collecting those oral histories. There's other projects like the Library of Congress, but that's something that museum has always done great, and always provided that and sharing that with people. And I know that's been a great asset for all of us, all historians as well as teachers and people who want to learn more about it. Another thing that we're going through our new World War II exhibition planning and exercise right now. Will open in a few years now as part of our transformation project. And the other, in addition to oral histories and looking at what their experiences were, we also look at what the people were saying at the time. So using contemporary sources, whether it's film or newsreels, imagery, memoirs, that were written at the time, so people can you can walk around their shoes and experience what they were thinking at the time. And sometimes that allows you to experience what they're seeing without getting a late 20th, early 21st century kind of viewpoint on something.
And it doesn't always have to be the general or the fighter pilot. It can be just the soldier down in the trenches that has an important story to tell, right?
That's right.
Absolutely. We found that that's the most powerful way to get the story of World War II across, is that you can find yourself relating a lot easier to the 20-year-old Marine on Peleliu than you can to the 65-year-old general who's 20 miles behind the lines. You can relate a lot easier to that Marine than you can General Douglas MacArthur. I mean, let's be real.
Well, and if you head over and check out the latest episode of STEM in 30, we've got student reporter Jaden Jefferson, who interviews a veteran who actually happened to turn out to be an astronaut. We didn't tell him that beforehand. And he helped coach up another student on doing an interview with Katie Dano, a helicopter pilot who's currently serving at Andrews Air Force Base. And then he's got some tips on how you can collect your own oral history from veterans, or even right now, just with your family members, because we're kind of going through a historic time right now. So we encourage everybody to check that out. All right, I'm going to start a fight. I know I'm going to start a fight here. And the question is, what was the most important airplane in World War II?
Ooh. You got to ask yourself, though. Oh, hold on. Somebody wants to say hi real quick. You might remember this dude here. This is my son, Sullivan. So he was in the STEM in 30 project with us, and he just wanted to say hey.
Hey, Sully, thanks for helping us out on the STEM in 30 episode. We appreciate it.
And his birthday is Sunday on Mother's Day, too. So
awesome. Well, happy birthday, Sully, and thanks for all the help.
Thanks, guys.
I would say that, in terms of what's the most important airplane, when I'm asked that, I usually say I like to talk about war-winning weapons, that there are technologies of airplanes that come around at a certain point in the war, and they are that crucial part of that story. And so the North American P51 Mustang is a war-winning weapon. When it's introduced in late 1944, by the end of the war, 15 of the 16 fighter groups of the 8th Air Force were flying P51s. A majority of the 15th Air Force fighter groups are flying this airplane. And it's escorting the bombers all the way deep into Germany, onwards on the other side of Berlin as well, towards Poland, but also that the tactics of how those airplanes are used. And we know that fighter groups would escort certain segments of a bomber run. Right. And so when those fighter groups are coming back and forth, meeting to escort the bombers, especially on their way back, they would do fighter sweeps. They would attack airfields, attack anything on the countryside. The pilots attended clobber colleges. And so you have these young American pilots in their 20s, roaming the countryside, destroying everything, and they want a fight. And once again, it's we've been talking about destroying the Luftwaffe. That's how they did that. So the P-51 is a good example of that, especially in regards to this celebration of VE Day for me.
Yeah, and again, Jeremy, I'm going to agree with you. You know, if we're talking Pacific, which we're not, but if we're talking Pacific, I would challenge that. But in this regard, no, I think the 51 is a game changer because, you know, like you said, the 51 comes out in December 43, an ETO, late 43, and it, you know, it really starts making an impact in early January 44. But before the 51 ever came out, we still had the 47, we still had the P38, and, you know, the RAF had the Spits, they had the Spitfires, and they're still there in 45, but they did not have the range. You know, the 47s, they're huge. I mean, that's why they were called the Jug, you know. I mean, they could not go all the way out there. They just didn't have the range. But the 51 did. And when the 51 could bring them back and forth, you know, as you kind of like, I like to refer to what you were saying, it's like a baton race, you know. The 38s had handed the 47s, they'd hand it the 51s, and they'd come all the way back, boom, boom, boom. And that was a game changer. It was a game changer.
Yeah, and, you know, in each of those fighters, the P38, the 47, the 51, they would have drop tanks. Yeah. And so that would extend their range too. So these great illustrations you'll see of the range being extended, but it's that Mustang with the drop tanks and that larger tank behind the pilot gets those airplanes out there where they can get to those long range missions. Also add, my favorite thing about the P47 was called the Hammer, right? It was 850 caliber machine guns, the 56 fighter group. They made that airplane sing as a fighter, you know, going against the Nazis, the Luftwaffe. So yeah, that's why I like to talk about war-winning weapons, because it's every theater, every moment's different, but these designs come out of those stories.
Also,
no doubt.
We've got some more questions about the P51 coming in. We'll get to those here in a second. Kate, somebody wants to know if you have any book recommendations for middle schoolers.
Ooh, book recommendations for middle schoolers. I actually do. We have a few. So if your students like dogs and like reading about dogs, Kirby Larson wrote a few books. There are two actually. And we have interviewed her about dogs in World War II. One is called Liberty, and it's about a dog on the home front. And there is another one called Code Word Courage, which is actually a very, very favorite book of mine about dogs and the code talkers in World War II. And one more book that I actually personally have not read, but teachers, every time I talk to them, ask me about this book and this author. And it is Alan Gratz's Refugee book. And he's actually going to be talking to us next fall, next school year. But that book, schools and students across the country are reading. And it's about World War II, but it's also about a few other times in history. But I have heard only amazing things about using that book to teach World War II.
Awesome. All right, we've got another shout out here. Catherine would like a shout out. She's loving the air and space stuff in World War II, so thank you for watching. Also, Ohio, New Jersey, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, all across the country tuning in. And we've got so many questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. And so this kind of comes back to something we were talking about earlier. Brian wants to know, what impact did the Tuskegee Airmen have on bombing runs of the 15th?
The 332nd Fighter Group, which is their proper designation, which was commonly known as the Tuskegee Airmen, they were another fighter group in the 15th Air Force. Their role was no more important, no less important than any other fighter groups in the 15th Air Force or 8th Air Force or 9th Air Force or whatever. Their job was to protect the 17s and 24s that were coming out of Foggia, Italy, and different bases are in that area to bomb targets in Romania, Czechoslovakia, or Czech Republic now, and they were there to protect the bombers. They did a fantastic job. I mean, just like any other fighter group did. I'd forget, Jeremy, you might be able to elaborate on their exact kill records, but I mean, you know, the mission of a fighter is to kill enemy airplanes, but it's also to protect your own. And the 332nd did that. You know,
I think that's
they
something.
excelled at that, frankly.
Yeah, I think that. The 332nd, or they would, at the time, I think would have been called the Red Tails, right? Because they're red tails, because all the 15th fighter groups, their tails were painted in their group markings, whereas the 8th Air Force, their noses were, but that red tail. And so they really prided themselves in protecting the bombers. But you'll see one of the images in the slideshow of Lucky Lester, who was one of the 332nd pilots who shot down Luftwaffe aircraft. And so they went after the Luftwaffe in that spirit. I mean, when we talk about young Americans and Mustangs going after Luftwaffe, it's the Red Tails as well. So they're being aggressive, but they really took pride in protecting the bombers. And so that was that strength that they had. And the arduous missions that were coming up from Italy, where the 15th operated from too, they had, they're flying over the Alps. They're flying up through Germany, up into Romania and Central Europe. And so that's a very hard duty for them, in addition to all those other 15th fighter groups. And then, and then the symbolism of, the Red Tails is that they are, fighting for their country, but also fighting for a greater place in American society. And they take that pride in patriotism and service, especially Benjamin O. Davis, their leader. But they're seeing that too, is that they want a broader role in America, and they see it that way. Now, it's not perfect, and there's other things happen within the broader African American experience, and especially Army Air Forces. But they are there to stay, and they're there to fight.
They were a catalyst for a lot of post-war action too. Their war record, as it was fantastic, and they served as a catalyst for a lot of the change that occurred post-war too, especially with the B-26 military.
And those former Red Tails who were transitioned to the Air Force, they, after Truman's executive order to integrate the American military, they are there in the Air Force, and they're fighting in an integrated Air Force in Korea and beyond.
Awesome. We've got a couple of more shout outs. Felicity, happy birthday. Thank you for tuning in. Happy birthday on Sunday. And then Peter would like us to give a shout out to both of his grandfathers who were World War II veterans in the Pacific. So Peter, to your grandparents, thank you so much. My grandfather served in World War II. He was over in Europe. And then my dad was in the Air Force as well, not during World War II. But so for all of those veterans out there watching, we really appreciate it. Thank you all for so many questions coming in. We've got a question from Ramona, and she wants to know, were there any female American pilots during World War II? I read something about the Russian night witches. Can you tell us about that?
Well, there is a precedent for women participating in the military and combat. It's with the Soviet Air Force during World War II. There, the night witches would fly these biplanes at night to kind of stir up, keep the Nazi, the Wehrmacht especially, on guard. But then there were women pilots flying ground attack aircraft such as the IL-2 Sturmovik, as well as some fighter pilots. And so it's a precedent for women in the military in combat. But I'll defer to Seth if you want to talk about the American example.
Well, yeah, there were several American examples. Most notably, of course, is the WACS, the Women's Army Auxiliary Army Air Corps. So what they would do generally. Now, there weren't any American female pilots who saw combat in World War II that I know of. I mean, I am not an expert on everything, but I'm fairly certain that that's accurate. Their job in the United States was to ferry aircraft back and forth from the factories to the bases, so they could get overseas and be utilized in combat or training or whatever. But they served a very important role. They played a very important role in the United States during the war, because a lot of the males were overseas fighting, and these airplanes had to go somewhere, and they had to be taken by somebody. And these women proved themselves perfectly capable. I mean, these were people who were flying aircraft that supposedly only men could fly, and they're flying B-29s, and they're flying P51s, and they're flying F-4U Corsairs. I mean, they're flying the baddest airplanes of the day, just as good as anybody else. And they just didn't do it in combat in the United States, but it didn't matter. They were doing the same thing, and they were doing it just as well as anybody else.
Nice.
Well, and they were part of this vast war machine, right?
Yeah, right.
Making it happen. I mean, America produces 300,000 airplanes during World War II, and those airplanes need to get from the factory, sometimes on modification center, to a training field, to the deployment field, and they're really they're being part of the war, and the women who fly are contributing in that way. And we've been talking about this a lot in regards to there's the sacrifice, as well as that whether it's in the Army Air Forces in Europe, Navy and the Marines in the Pacific, and then the WASPs, especially the Women's Air Force Service pilots. I mean, they are losing their lives, and there is women who are still lost today. They're MIA. There was a WASP during World War II, so they are contributing to this warfare with their very lives.
We actually just interviewed a woman who wrote a book about the Wasps, and she told us really cool stories about how many of the women were indeed transporting planes across the country to eventually get over to combat, and they would put notes and leave little pieces of writings in the planes. And then when they got to the Pacific or they got to Europe, the pilots who were flying them combat would find these notes. And many of them kept these notes for years and years after World War II, which I just thought was a really, really cool story that I didn't know.
That is great. And
Yeah, that's great.
We had a comment, Cass, don't worry. She was cooking while her son's listening. And so don't worry, we're going to put the links to some of these resources in the comment section after the show is over today. So be watching for those. All right, we've got so many questions coming in. And this one I want to pitch to all three of you. Angie wants to know if you have movie recommendations, and I want to kind of build on that. What's your favorite World War II movie?
Well, it just so happens that the National World War II Museum has a podcast on World War II movies and film called Service on Celluloid, and yours truly is the host. Kate in there has been on it before as well. And what we do is we dissect World War II movies for their accuracy or inaccuracy, Pearl Harbor. But as far as favorite movies are concerned, I got two. And being even a Pacific Theater aficionado, if you will, both of them are European movies. One of them is Battleground, fantastic film. And the other one's 12 O'Clock High. And because we're talking about Army Air Forces generally in World War II in Europe, you can't find a better movie than 12 O'Clock High.
Jeremy, how about you?
Well, looking at the film record of World War II, they're the films produced during the war. They're that reflect the current events, and then there's the stories that are told afterwards, looking back. And what instantly jumped in my head were films about the bombing campaign. Of course, 12 O'Clock High, Command Decision, which is kind of like the book into that, which is on the Owen Wister-Haynes play made into a film. What really jumped out in my mind too immediately was a movie called The War Lover, which is based on the John Hersey book, another 8th Air Force book starring Steve McQueen. And so if you want to be cool and you want to watch an 8th Air Force movie, you can watch that. Battle of Britain is a classic movie, just about that color, 1969. And then a real sleeper for me that I really like is Howard Hawks's Air Force, which came out just after American entry into World War II, and it tells the story of a B-17 that's traveling from America to Hawaii through Wake Island to the Philippines, right in the wake of the Japanese attack in 1941. So
awesome.
This film that really sticks out for me.
Yeah.
Kate, how about you?
Well, this actually might cause a fight more than anything. So I will say it's definitely Tora. But as a kid, I lived in Hawaii. My dad was a Marine, so I'm a Marine brat. And I watched Pearl Harbor, the Ben Affleck movie, be filmed right from my recess. I know some of the extras in it. And so that personal connection, Seth, that Pearl Harbor, inaccurate or even worse, is near and dear to my heart.
Nice. Those are all awesome movies. We've got somebody that wants to know, what role, if any, did gliders have at this point in the war?
At what point? Are we talking 1945?
Sure.
Okay. Well, there were, of course, the famous operation for gliders was, of course, June 6, 1944. Of course, that's D-Day. There was 300. There were glider regiments in the 82nd and 101st Airborne that came in either on D-Day night or the night or morning after. And then, of course, there were the Brits at Pegasus Bridge. They're probably the most famous and successful, honestly, glider operation of the war. Gliders go all the way back, up into 1940 when the Fallschirmjäger are landing on top of Eben Emael as they're invading through the Low Countries in the Blitzkrieg in 1940. But in 1945, they were lesser used. And Jeremy, I don't remember off the top of my head right now, but I do believe, they were used in Operation Market Garden in 1944 in September in the invasion of Holland. And I do believe they were used in Operation Varsity in March 1945, but to a lesser extent than they were previous, because they were dangerous. Flat out. If they hit the ground too hard, everybody in is going to get killed or seriously injured.
Seth, could you tell us exactly what is a glider? How did a glider work for those of us who aren't quite sure?
Okay, yeah, so it's easy. So I mean, they float, but no, what they would do, the Waco and the Horsa gliders were towed by, like on D-Day and Market Garden specifically, they were towed by C-47s, and the C-47s provided the power, to get them up to altitude and get them relatively near to their objectives, and then the glider pilots they pulled this lever locking mechanism that was in the cockpit, big old thing, and it bust loose from the C-47, and they glide it down to where they needed to be. And these things had DZs, they had drop zones just like the 502nd did when they dropped into Normandy. I mean, they had drop zones. Generally, they were clear fields. And if you ever look at pictures of Normandy in 1944, especially just before the invasion, you'll see, General Erwin Rommel had a lot of odd devices that he wanted to set up to stop an Allied invasion. One of the things that he did is he cut down a lot of the trees in Normandy, and he planted these open fields with these tree trunks. They called them Rommel's asparagus, and what they were for was to stop glider landings. And it worked to some extent. But gliders were utilized in the European theater several times with varying degrees of success, but they were powered by C-47s. Later on in the war, I want to say at Varsity, a lot of them were pulled by 47s and C-46 commandos too. But and they were actually used after the war. But their World War II era was really the only time that they were used heavily in any kind of combat.
All right, Marcella from Colorado wants to know how space was involved in the Second World War, and I think talking a little bit about Operation Paperclip there. Can one of you tell us a bit about that?
Well, go ahead, Seth.
No, go ahead, man. That's all you.
Well, the scientific and technological heritage of World War II reflects much of the collection of data and information from Nazi Germany. These collection of examples of V2 missiles and V1 flying bombs, swept wing aircraft, wind tunnel data. All this information is being collected by teams of technical personnel that have been recently inducted or part of the Army, representing manufacturers as well, and they're collecting this information. And part of that is taking those German rocket engineers, led by Werner von Braun, to come to America to develop, a ballistic missile program that leads to our space race, our, NASA, and eventually, the United States getting to the moon. But there's a lot more data in regards to that in terms of what airplanes are going to look like after World War II. So the 35-degree wing sweep we see on airliners today, that's from Nazi aeronautical data from World War II that Boeing takes to build in their first successful jet aircraft, the B-47, which becomes the 707 airliner, that kind of legacy. And also the core, and we're talking about collections and museums, the Air and Space Museum's collections of Axis aircraft reflects that collection of data and technical objects, and that's what helped form the core of the museum when all these no longer needed examples of enemy technology is now being put into a museum that becomes the National Air Museum in the late 1940s and then becomes the Air and Space Museum in 1976.
Awesome. And if you want to learn a little bit more about Operation Paperclip, I got a chance to go to the New Mexico Museum of Space History, which has just a little model rocket sitting in a case, and you don't think much of it. And then one of the curators pointed out, oh, that model was Werner von Braun's. And they were able to tell us a little bit about that story of Operation Paperclip. And one of our editors, Ryan, actually found a picture of von Braun with that model. And so if you check out the STEM in 30 Facebook page, you'll see that video about Operation Paperclip. So Jeremy, we're going to have a question here that I think is really going to be in your wheelhouse. Jessica wants to know about what flak cannon was the best at shooting down fighters and bombers, and then I think there's an artifact in our collection that's kind of in your wheelhouse, Jeremy. So Seth, can you talk a little bit about that cannon?
Well, I mean, every anti-aircraft gun, according to Allied airmen, be they British, Canadian, American, whatever, everything that shot at them was an 88. And that is the same for infantry on the ground. Every piece of artillery was an 88. Well, the Germans never made that many 88s. Let's be real. But to be honest, at least in my personal opinion, the most feared and probably the most reliable German anti-aircraft artillery weapon was the 88. This is, of course, the this is the main German anti-aircraft artillery weapon. They had larger ones, but the 88 was the most widely produced of that genre. And the Germans had a pretty sophisticated way of putting up anti-aircraft fire over a target. They didn't just randomly shoot. Now, some of their lesser weapons, some of the lower caliber weapons did do that, especially like roving fighters. But as the formations of B-17s and 24s are coming in, a lot of them were radar directed, and they would fire and volley, battery fire. And so they put up these huge, the planes would be coming in, and all of a sudden, boom, there's this blanket of flak in front of them or in them, behind them, underneath them, whatever. And the Germans are gauging their altitude. And if you look at pictures of a bombing raid over Germany, specifically a lot of targets over the Ruhr, which was the Germans' industrial heartland, and places like Bremen, where there were big shipyards, and in Berlin too, obviously. There is literally a blanket of flak. And I mean, I knew a gazillion guys in the 8th Air Force bomber crews that said, over certain targets, Bremen being one, that, the flak was so thick you could, quote, walk on it, or you could, quote, taxi on it. And I mean, it was incredible. And it was pretty dang accurate, considering these guys are literally just throwing things up at the air and hoping it hits something. They were pretty accurate. I mean, there's a reason you see B-17s coming back to England full of holes.
Jeremy, do you want to talk a little bit about flak bait?
Sure. The Air and Space Museum is treating and preparing for display a Mark B26 Marauder. Its name was flak bait. And it's the American airplane that survived the most missions of World War II. It's just 202 missions. And it's a survivor of World War II. It's an original airplane, and it has just over 1,000 individual patches from flak and cannon and machine gun fire that this airplane flew through over the course of 200 missions. And so flying from mid-1943 and its 200th missions on April 17th, 1945, just a week, over a week from our VE Day remembrance. And so this is an airplane that survived this bitter air war. It was a part of a tactical air force, but they flew through flak. The Marauder crews called themselves flak bait in general, but the commander of this particular airplane named it flak bait. It was kind of a home thing. That a dog back home, his nickname was Flea Bait, and they knew about the German aircraft artillery, and so flak bait. And so when you look at that nose art, it's flak bait, and it's in a bursting flak burst that's red there, and so they embraced that, and then the airplane lived up to its name, and so that's our iconic artifact of World War II, especially when we talk about VE Day, because this airplane on April 17th was bombing Magdeburg, Germany, which is on the Elbe River. So they're pushing, east, and they're just within days, the Allies, the British and Americans, part of the Allies, are meeting the Soviet armies as they're converging together. So flak bait is part of that story. And what I like to say about the airplane is that it's much like an M1 Garand battle.
Jeremy may have frozen for a second. If you get a chance to see flak bait up close, it's absolutely incredible, because it is all beat up, and it looks like it's been through a war. Kate, can you talk a little bit about, the museums are closed right now, and so we can use images to do this, but when we get a chance to go into not just a big museum like National Air and Space Museum or the World War II Museum, what can we learn by looking at those objects?
Oh, you can learn a lot. I think the most interesting thing, so I'm not really a weapons or a battle person. I like the individual stories, right? So talking about flak bait, who were the people that flew it? Who were the people that patched those 1,000 holes and hoped it would continue to fly? And, so in a museum, a lot of times you have the artifact, and then you have the story that goes with it. Also, what happened with the life of that artifact? I get asked from students all the time, where do you get your stuff? Where do you get your planes and your artifacts? And so the life of the artifact during World War II and over period of time before it ends up in the museum is all part of history. And you can learn that by, coming into the museum and talking to educators and talking to, our volunteers who are standing there. So the personal stories, again, so not listening to the oral histories, but looking at what those oral histories, people in them used, is by far my favorite part of a museum.
And Jeremy, when you were working on flight, go ahead.
Is that all those stories, and then we have the stories that didn't move, that didn't stay in terms of, we think we have a record, just over 358 individual Army Air Forces crew flew in flak bait.
Wow.
And not a single one of them was killed in the airplane. There were 2 significant instances of the pilot and the bombardier being wounded. But that doesn't mean that those crewmen that were flying in other airplanes, because these crews would fly in different jump crews, different crews flying different airplanes, that those individuals weren't killed and they weren't, or they became POWs. So there's all these layers of the ones that fell during the war, the ones that were out of action, the POW, the ones that survived and lived many years to share their stories. So trying to bring all those together is another way to do that.
And I was a teacher for 17 years, and I look back to field trips that I took, and I kick myself for how bad I was, because, I didn't use these objects and really dig into the stories that they could tell. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about working at the museum now, is being able to look at an airplane. And I think most people look at an airplane, they appreciate the technology, but those stories behind it. And so we're just about out of time. I want to kind of leave with, do you guys each have like a story that fits into the topic that we're talking about today, World War II and victory in Europe, that kind of summarizes it for you, like a favorite story? Seth, do you have one?
Oh, man. So for 12 years of my 15 at the National World War II Museum, I headed the museum's research department, where we collected oral histories. And we built the National World War II Museum's oral history, or video history, however you want to say, personal history archive. So can I pull out one? Probably not. But when we're talking about the Army Air Forces in World War II, there's like 2 or 3 guys that pop in my mind immediately that I knew or came to know. Colonel Bud Anderson, Clarence E. Anderson, the pilot of Old Crow, P51 Mustang Old Crow, one of the more famous P51s ever. Triple Ace in World War II. Bud's still with us. Bud's still alive. He's a fantastic human being. He's incredibly, smart. He's an incredible human being, and he's the one that comes to mind, because he was that P51 pilot that Jeremy and I were talking about. He was that young, sharp, flashy, dashing. When you think of a fighter pilot, that was Bud Anderson. I mean, the gleaming white teeth and the sunglasses and the $1 million smile. That was Bud. Is Bud. He's still Bud. But I mean, this guy's flying P51s out of England in 1944 all the way to the end of the war. He does a couple of tours over there. Like I said, he's a triple ace. He flies with Yeager. He flies with Johnny England. And he flies with all these incredible aviators, of which he is one, obviously. And I mean, he was the cutting edge, man. I mean, he's the kind of guy that helped win the war, because he's flying that war-winning machine that Jeremy was talking about. He's flying that P-51 over Berlin. He's shooting down 16.25 German aircraft in individual aerial combat. I mean, this guy is just incredible. He is, when I think of the Army Air Forces in Europe in World War II, I think of Bud Anderson. I think of some of the guys I knew in the 100th Bomb Group, Bob Shones being one who flew the March 6, 1944 Berlin raid in Aargau, Sal, the B-17. Bob flew 28 missions with the Bloody 100th and lived to tell the tale, which in and of itself is a miracle. I could go on and on, but I won't, because I'll just honk all the time, and I don't want to do that. But those are 2 of the guys that come on.
Kid, do you have a favorite story?
Oh, again, I have a couple, but I actually have a pretty personal one. So my grandparents were kids living in Germany during World War II and during VE Day. And my grandpa saw the Americans come through this small town outside of Regensburg, and he got to know Americans, and he decided that he was going to come to America after the war and join the U.S. Air Force himself and become an American. And so it was my story that sticks out.
Awesome. Jeremy?
I think I'm glad I was last so I could figure this out. But I agree with Seth. If we added some pictures for you guys to see during the discussion, and if I could have found a picture of Bud Anderson, I would have, the one that I could have used, because he's a great example of that. But I want to talk about a pilot who flew flak bait. His name is Sherman Best. And he flew through the summer of 1944 flying B-26s in the 322nd Bomb Group, 449th Bomb Squadron. And he flew on D-Day. He flew through the Battle of the Bulge. He flew through the, that time of the war in which these bombers are supporting the troops on the ground, just going just ahead of them to make it easier for those troops on the ground. Well, he survived the war, and he's a father in the 60s, and his kid shows up in the Western Auto and goes, "Look, Dad, your airplane's a model." And a model company made Flak Bait as a model. He's showing his dad that, and saying how proud he was of his father. And then Sherman would come and visit the nose of Flak Bait, when it was on display in the World War II gallery, just the nose of it. But he came to see the complete airplane altogether again in late 2014, and his family was there with him, and it really showed how strong that generation is in regards to their connection, and they're proud, their service, but they thought about the men they lost, the men that weren't there, and then also the strength of the families and their memories and all that is there as well. So a lot of people kind of, I'm not going to say they're cynical, say, well, World War II is not going to be interesting anymore because the veterans are going to pass away. But I really think that the families, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren are always going to carry the story, especially Americans, and how they feel about what did dad, granddad, great-granddad, what did they do in World War II, and all these different stories kind of come together. And so Sherman Best just being connected to Flak Bait was that way, but we look at our collection as a way to kind of have those so people can come and bring their own perspectives and stories with those as well, especially from this veterans viewpoint.
And I know for me, the story that's passed down through my family, and it's not VE Day, it's VJ Day, but my mom's family had sat down for a catfish dinner that they had caught out of the pond on their farm, and somebody banged on the door and they were kind of way out in the country, and so it was unusual. And they're like, "Henry, I think he was on leave from serving." And they're like, "Come on, we got to ring the church bell. The war is over." And they went down to the little church and they rang the church bell all night long. And that's just this really great personal story. And so I appreciate you all sharing those stories and for joining us today. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We got to a bunch of questions. There's a lot of them we didn't get to, and we're going to go back and try to answer some of those in the comments, and we'll put those links in there as well. For everybody that tuned in all across the country and literally across the world, we appreciate it. If you get a chance when things clear up to go down to New Orleans and see the National World War II Museum, we encourage that, and we hope that you come visit us in Washington, D.C. or Chantilly, Virginia at the National Air and Space Museum. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks for watching.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thanks.